In January 1824, Greece was the location for the end of an era in English literature. The death of Lord Byron, as he fought for the cause of Greek independence, marks the conclusion of English poetry's Romantic age. Keats and Shelley were already dead. The finest poems of Wordsworth and Coleridge had already been written. With the death of Byron, the greatest ever period of English verse drew to its close. Inevitably, the achievements of the Romantics overshadowed the work of those that came after them. Yet the English poets of the later 19th century created some of the finest verse in the whole of the English language, at a time when Britain was more powerful than ever before. They are the poets of the Victorian age. The 63-year reign of Queen Victoria saw Great Britain at the peak of her power as a nation. Industry and commerce made Britain wealthy, and the strength of the Royal Navy made her secure. It was a time of invention and achievement in all areas of life. In literature, the Victorian age saw the increasing popularity of the novel, with the works of Dickens, Thackeray, Trollope, and many others. In poetry, too, it was a productive age. The Victorian nonsense verses of Edward Lear and Lewis Carroll remain popular today, while more traditional poetic forms also flourished. With hindsight, 5 poets can be seen as the key figures of Victorian verse: Gerard Manley Hopkins, Algernon Charles Swinburne, Matthew Arnold, Robert Browning, and the greatest of them all, Alfred Tennyson. The poetic talent of Alfred Tennyson revealed itself early on in life. Born in 1809 in the Lincolnshire village of Somersby, the son of a clergyman, the boy Tennyson began to compose verse at the age of just 8. In his youth, he explored the wide variety of poetic forms and showed a keen enthusiasm for Byron. In 1827, he went up to Cambridge University, where he soon won a prize for Timbuktu, a blank verse composition. In 1830, while still a student, he published his first solo volume of work and formed an intense friendship with Arthur Hallam, a fellow poet. Although Tennyson left university without a degree, he was, by then, convinced of his destiny as a man of verse. In 1832, he published his second anthology, simply entitled Poems. These early volumes attracted the attention of Leigh Hunt, the poet and critic, who had earlier recognized the genius of John Keats. The second volume also included The Lady of Shalott, an early indication of Tennyson's fascination with the legends of King Arthur. It would be an interest that would last his entire life.
Tennyson had been interested in the story of King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table from a small boy. He'd read Malory, he'd read other historical sources, he'd begun to write prose accounts of the story, and it stayed with him really almost till the end of his poetic career. When, in that very fertile period of writing after Arthur Hallam's death and before, he wrote The Lady of Shalott, which is a version of the story of Lancelot and Elaine. In the period immediately after Arthur Hallam's death, he wrote Morte d'Arthur, which he then rewrote as the passing of Arthur in the Idylls of the King.
The Arthurian legends offered Tennyson a kind of escape from the modern world. Tennyson, like many Victorian poets, felt that the modern world was an unpoetic world. Arthurian legend gave him an idealized set of characters, an idealized landscape. This was a world of love and chivalry and beauty.
The medieval knights in armour, the legends of the Middle Ages too, like King Arthur, provide the obvious point of contrast. So that if you wanted to say, what is the condition of modern life, one way of answering that question is to say, what was the other condition of life? And one very vivid way of dramatising it was to choose Arthurian subject matter, because the other way of life was not just sort of socially and economically different, it also involved different religious assumptions, for example. And the Arthurian legend, as it had been developed in the Middle Ages, had very strong Christian connotations.
The notion of playing with Arthurian myth was very much a notion of challenging a modernising society at the very basis of its ideals. Ideals is the word we want here. This is idealistic poetry. We must add the rider to that the ideals for Tennyson the young Alfred Tennyson, as well as the later Alfred Lord Tennyson, these ideals are always doomed at profound levels. It makes for a melancholy poetry, and one in which a youthful, oppositional stance can easily harden over time into a melancholic conservatism.
Tennyson's earliest works were often harshly criticised, and this proved depressing for a man who was naturally gloomy. In 1833, an event occurred which made him even more distressed: the death of his dear college friend Arthur Hallam. Tennyson was devastated. He turned away from poetry in favour of reading and reflective contemplation. For almost 10 years, he published virtually nothing.
The friendship between Arthur Hallam and Tennyson has been constantly mulled over by biographers and by critics. It was a very intense emotional friendship of the kind that many Victorian young men had. It was a kind of meeting of minds, and also they found one another extremely congenial. Tennyson had a very lively family with sisters and a mother at home in Somersby. Arthur Hallam's father, Henry, was a distinguished historian, a very loving father, but a very cold man. So Hallam, if you like, was in love with the whole Tennyson family, and more specifically, he was in love, or became in love, fell in love with Tennyson's sister, Emily, whom he was to marry.
This deliberate silence had consequences for his personal life. It prevented him marrying his fiancée, Emily Selwood. But Emily was prepared to wait for Alfred, and eventually his muse returned. In 1842, he published a further 2-volume compilation of work, again simply entitled Poems. In it, he tackled a variety of poetic forms. In Morte d'Arthur, he demonstrated his mastery of the idyll as he returned once again to the Arthurian theme. The Poems compilation also demonstrated Tennyson's abilities in lyric verse.
Break, break, break on thy cold grey stones, O sea, and I would that my tongue could utter the thoughts that arise in me. Oh, well for the fisherman's boy that he shouts with his sister at play. Oh, well for the sailor lad that he sings in his boat on the bay. And the stately ships go on to their haven under the hill. But oh, for the touch of a vanished hand and the sound of a voice that is still. Break, break, break at the foot of thy crags, O sea. But the tender grace of a day that is dead will never come back to me.
It's not insignificant that the poem uses the image of the sea and the waves. Tennyson linked the sea with the death of Hallam. Hallam had died in Vienna very suddenly of apoplexy, but he was brought home by his father to be buried in England. The journey was by sea. It crops up in Memoriam, and it began here with this very poignant poem in which the breaking of the waves recall to Tennyson his grief over his friend.
Tennyson, like his great contemporary, the novelist Dickens, had an astonishing capacity, a very rare capacity, to be simple and complicated at the same time. He was genuinely popular, and the poem has that kind of insistent rhythm, simple rhythm. It has emotional openness and directness. The diction is simple, it doesn't use complicated words, the imagery is simple and familiar. So it speaks very immediately, and yet it's actually a rather tricky, complicated, ingenious poem. It begins by making you think it's going to be a romantic nature poem. It's all going to be about the sea. And it isn't at all. It's all about social and human things. And at the end of the poem, it suddenly emerges that the point about the sea is not, as it would be for Wordsworth or a romantic poet, that the sea, wild nature, is like us. On the contrary, the point is that it's very alien from us. The sea goes on endlessly, breaking on the beach, but human beings die and disappear and are lost.
Throughout his long working life, Tennyson continued to use a variety of poetic forms, including the elegy, the poem in praise of the departed dead. Throughout his years of silence and in the years that followed, he worked on the elegy that would make him a famous man.
But thou and I are one in kind, as moulded like in nature's mint, and hill and wood and field did print the same sweet forms in either mind.
In Memoriam Memoriam is one of the greatest poems of the Victorian age. It's great, I think, because it registers universal human emotions of love and loss, grief for the lost love. But it does so in a way that is quite modern, in the sense that it shows us the fluctuations of grief and of love. The fact that human feeling doesn't run a smooth course.
In Memoriam was, and is still, far more than just a tribute to a lost acquaintance. It's also a study in spiritual meaning. Profound questions concerning the purpose of life on Earth are addressed. Technically, it was also significant. Tennyson was amongst the first English poets to adopt the A-B-B-A rhyme structure, which contributes so much to the recurring sadness of the verse.
The final line, although it rhymes with the first line, nonetheless isn't part of a couplet, and therefore sounds somehow less conclusive than the two middle lines. It hints at the doubt, the uncertainty that Tennyson's talking about in intellectual terms in the poem as a whole.
Far off thou art, but ever nigh. I have thee still, and I rejoice. I prosper, circled with thy voice. I shall not lose thee, though I die.
In Memoriam, which was published in 1850, is a work that Tennyson was hoarding up in small pieces for many years before. In fact, it's only quite late in the work's composition that Tennyson begins to realise he's dealing not with a series of short, interrelated lyrics, but with one large poem. It is, for me, the greatest long poem of the 19th century. But we must remember that this long poem is made up of separate and often really rather short lyric moments.
In Memoriam was the poem that made Alfred Tennyson famous. Published in 1850, its success meant he was now able to marry his longtime fiancée, and the same year he was appointed State Poet of Great Britain, the Poet Laureate. Unlike some others who have held the post, Tennyson took his duties as national poet seriously. He composed a memorable tribute to the British general and statesman, the Duke of Wellington, and in 1854 he published possibly his best-known poem, an account of a disastrous engagement of the Crimean War, The Charge of the Light Brigade. The whole conflict was noteworthy for the incompetence of the British commanders, but the charge of the Light Brigade proved especially disastrous for their unfortunate troops. Tennyson's words to describe it have never been surpassed.
Half a league, half a league, half a league onward, all in the valley of death rode the 600. Forward, the Light Brigade, charge for the guns, he said. Into the valley of death rode the 600. Forward, the Light Brigade! Was there a man dismayed? Not though the soldier knew someone had blundered. Theirs not to make reply, theirs not to reason why, theirs but to do and die. Into the valley of death rode the 600.
The Charge of the Light Brigade may not have been Tennyson's greatest technical achievement, but its publication only served to increase his status. He was now a major public figure. But, as is often the case, we can now see that Tennyson's greatest work was written before he became famous. Not that he was idle in his later decades. He continued to work on a prodigious scale, writing dramas and further compilations of poetry. He also returned to the Arthurian legends, which he loved so much. In 1885, at the age of 76, he finally published Idylls of the King, a definitive interpretation of the Arthurian legend where the nature of human relationship is once again addressed.